I feel like a senior, very much. So why improving resilience and efficiency? It has been said before, I can be brief. We want resilient and efficient animals because we think they are better at dealing with the increasing frequency of environmental disturbances due to climate change. Yep, and we want to improve resilience and efficiency through breeding, which is one of the goals of GenTORE. But when we started with GenTORE, we had some questions. How can we breed for more resilient and efficient animals if these are very complex traits, depending on many factors? Well, how can we breed for resilience and efficiency if we don't have practical and scalable definitions? How can we breed for these if we don't have any models that can predict these traits already early in life? And how can we take into account the variation that can happen, for example, in efficiency throughout life? So these were some of the questions that we'd like to, well, at least shed a light on within GenTORE. And we chose to apply or use data to solve some of these questions. We know that many data are being collected. These data can be on farm specifics or farm characteristics like herd size, but we also have farm and animal performances data from the monthly milk recording system. But we also have increasingly often precision livestock farming technologies on farms, aka sensors that measures milk yield, activity, rumination. And a characteristic of these PLF technologies is that they are cow individual, they're longitudinal, and they're high frequent. And it is this characteristic that we want to explore and exploit to solve some of the answers that I just mentioned. So at the start, we did not have a practical and scalable definition, particularly not for resilience. So we worked at several approaches to do so within GenTORE. One of the approaches that we used was developed by Marieke Popper and her colleagues. And she used the responses in milk yield to environmental disturbances. And she used the assumption that resilience is the ability of an animal to be minimally affected by disturbances. And if they are affected, that they recover quickly. Now, she used milk yields that are provided by automatic milking systems. And she used these measurements, and she also used a predicted milk yield. And the difference between these two, that's what she used to develop resilience proxies. And she came up with two, the variance and the autocorrelation. And in the upper graph, you see an example of a cow that has low variance and a low autocorrelation. And we assume that this animal is a resilient one. On the bottom graph, you see a cow that has high variance and high autocorrelation values. And we think that this is a less resilient animal. Now, Marieke also calculated the heritabilities of these proxies. And they were both heritable, with variance having slightly higher heritabilities than the autocorrelation. And she linked it also to traits that we think or that we link to resilience, like fertility, production, or diseases. Both of these traits, these proxies, also had genetic correlations with these traits, although the variance showed higher genetic correlations than the autocorrelation. So this work, we thought, okay, the variance seems to be a very good proxy for resilience. Now, as I mentioned, Marieke used daily milk yields from an automatic milking system, but not everybody has an automatic milking system. So we also explored a different way of defining resilience, or a different proxy for resilience. And we came up with the lifetime resilience score, which is a cumulative result of the ability of a cow to recalve and pass on her genes to the next generation, taking into account aspects of production, fertility, and health. We wanted to use readily available data on many, many farms. And it's a score where we also compare an individual cow to her herd mates and peers. So that makes this lifetime resilience score also adapted or adopted to local circumstances. It's a very simple score. It has just a few areas, and it applies bonus or malus points depending on an individual cow performing better or worse than her peers. Finally, a trait that has been used is the longevity, where the assumption is that longevity is the result of all the positive benefits of resilience. And we have the true and functional longevity, where the true longevity is the ability of an animal to delay any culling or death. And the functional longevity is the ability of animals to avoid involuntary culling. So we had several methods, ways to define resilience. Then we also wanted to predict resilience using PLF or other data, but at least predicting early in life. And one of the things that we did is, well, I just talked about the longevity, the functional and true longevity. And we investigated or studied which traits measured in the first lactation were associated to culling and therefore associated with longevity. So a survival analysis was conducted with French Holstein cows to compute the longevity, and that was associated with traits measured in the first lactation. And we saw that insemination status, calving ease, conformation traits, in particular the udder depth, clinical mastitis, somatic cell count, and displaced abomasum, were traits that had a major effect on culling and therefore a major effect on the two longevity traits. And these risk factors for culling can be seen as early predictors for the length of true and functional longevity. It's a way of predicting. Another way of predicting was to use precision livestock farming data, and where we try to predict the ranking of resilience using these high-frequent data. So we took resilience, in this case, the lifetime resilience score as dependent variable, and the PLF data collected through the first lactation as independent source. But then the challenge is, if we have this longitudinal data, how to summarize it into variables that say something, that can be used as predictive variables. And we took basically two approaches. The first one is a summarizing approach. So we took the data collected over one lactation and we summarized these into curve parameters, summary statistics. This has the benefit that it's a very generic approach that we can apply to many more PLF technologies. And it also has the benefit that it perhaps does not require a lot of data quality and quantity. The downside is we're going to summarize quite a long period, and by summarizing it, we might ignore some of the disturbances. So the other approach was focusing really on those events where we see a deviation in a predicting milk yield. And we try to characterize these specific dynamics and use these variables as potentially predictive ones for a model. The benefit of that is then we really look into how cows react on environmental disturbances. The downside is that it put a lot more of requirements on data quality and quantity than the first method. We used, by the way, a logistic regression model and a machine learning model to predict resilience, the lifetime resilience score, using data in the first lactation. A quick glance here, you will see that it doesn't, well, we can predict it. It doesn't really matter which method we are using. But I would like to highlight that if we're going to use the curve dynamics, so the specific details when its milk yield is deviating from the predicted one, it seems to be better performing than the curve parameters, but there's a huge range between farms. So we were unable to develop a one-size-fits-all model. And the second thing I want to briefly highlight So when we use the machine learning approach, the data-driven approach, in this case a random forest, and we provided this random forest the same curve parameters as we provided the logistic regression model, it doesn't perform a lot better, which is jammer, sad, but hey, at least it's not worse. But it was a little bit surprising that when we give that random forest just simple daily values, it also performs similarly. And to me that meant, oh wow, so we can just simply do daily values of sensor measurement and can have a predictive model rather than extensively do extensive data pre-processing, which is needed for the logistic regression. Then finally, models and methodologies to account for the variation throughout production stages or lifetime. And here we specifically looked at the efficiency. And when we talk about efficiency within GenTORE, we basically talk about feed efficiency. And that's measured through the residual feed intake, which is simply put the difference between actual and predicted feed intake. Now, a common method to get to this residual feed intake is the use of linear regression. But by design, that method is incapable of taking the known variation into account because it assumes that the coefficients are constant through time, which they are not. We know that. So GenTORE tried a new methodology and came up with the dynamic residual feed intake. So we can measure residual feed intake at any time through a multiple trait regression. And I don't know the ins and outs, but people in this room do know. But it's the difference between the animal effect of the actual dry matter intake and the animal effect of the predicted intake for different energy sources, like milk, weight, and body condition score. How am I doing in time? I think it's, no, that's good. With what I showed you, the GenTORE has some applications and impact. We know that we can use longitudinal PLF data to quantify and predict cow-specific resilience. So a farmer can rank animals on his or her farm at any moment in time. And when we can predict it, also early in life, this can be a tool for farmers to decide which cows to keep and breed and which cows to replace. And it established the best animal in environment herd. We also identified risk factors for culling, and identifying these risk factors can help farmers and their advisors to focus on the areas that they do not score very well and try to improve that, and by doing so, improve resilience as well. And then finally, we have methodologies that can take into account the variation. It also means that if you rank animals for efficiency using the residual feed intake, it will vary across time. It will not be constant. And I did not say that in a previous slide, but GenTORE also looked at the best time period to quantify the feed efficiency, and that happened to be the steady state period, so for dairy cattle, the mid-lactation. It has been already briefly commented by the previous presenter that with all the work that we try to do with efficiency and feed efficiency, we do rely on actual feed intake, which is still a costly business to do so. And that will continue to be a limiting factor so far. And that was it. Thank you.